So a few months ago, I put together a 5-gallon brew in the bag walkthrough video. That day I brewed a Saison. Well, I set aside a couple of those bottles. I'm going to enter them in a competition. Well, today I'm going to discuss my process for creating that recipe. And I'm going to open up a bottle and see how it turned out. So if you're interested in the Saison, if you're interested in learning how to create your own recipes, be sure to stick around. If you're new to the channel, well, welcome. If you're returning, well, thanks for dropping back in. My name is Brent from Cascades Homebrew. The focus of my channel is about brewing great homebrew using modest equipment and simple processes. My passion is homebrewing. I've been doing it for 25 years. This channel gives me a reason to learn more and also to share my experience with people like you. So if you think you might like that type of content and you find this video useful, be sure to subscribe and hit the thumbs up. And for a limited time, if you subscribe to this video, we're going to give you access to all of my videos for free. What? That's not how it works? Oh well, go hit that subscribe and like button anyways, and stick around while we taste some Saisons. So today we're going to talk about brewing a Saison. Well, not really brewing a Saison. I already put out a video on how I brewed the Saison. Today we're going to talk about a couple other topics. So when I launched the website and channel, I came up with a tagline, Building Great Beer. It may sound kind of corny, but it's got some meaning. We're going to talk about that. Then we're going to talk about how I came up with my Saison recipe and how I took ideas to create what I'm working on for a house Saison recipe. And then I'm going to drink some beer. Well, no, and then I'm going to taste and evaluate the Saison. So this was the Saison that was brewed during the 5-gallon brew in the bag walkthrough video. I plan to enter this beer in the Dominion Cup competition. The judging has happened at the end of this week, so I should know by this next weekend how I did. And then I'll get my score sheets back. So I want to evaluate the beer, fill out a score sheet, and then compare it to what the judges said. So what do I mean by the tagline? Building great beer. Well, I like to think of building as more than just brewing. When we say brewing a beer, we think a lot about the brew day. We think a lot about milling our grains, mashing it in, boiling, adding ingredients along the way. Usually when you think of building something, you think of a more holistic approach. It starts at the beginning. What are my goals? In this case, your goals both for a recipe and your goals for brewing beer. You need to think a little bit about what equipment do I have? Do I have the skills and the knowledge to use that equipment and the ingredients that I may put into a recipe? And then building beer is also more than just brew day. It's thinking about your yeast and yeast health, thinking about fermentation, thinking about packaging, thinking about how you're going to serve it. So as an analogy of building, I like to think of something like a bench. Say we want to build a great bench. So before we can start building, we have to think of our goals. What kind of bench do we want? Is this an inside bench, an outside bench, 1 person, 3 person, 5 person? What kind of style do we want? Is it a painted bench? Is it a wood bench? What kind of features do we want? Do we want cup holders? Does it need to be comfortable? Does it need to be water resistant? And then once we've got the high level ideas of what we want in a bench, then we can start translating that into an executable plan. And then as we iterate through our design, we may have to change the design based on what type of items are available at the local supply. Is the wood that we want available? Is the type of brass fittings that we want available? So then as we're creating that plan, we may incorporate the skills and knowledge that we have, the type of joints that we know how to make, the type of wood that we've worked with in the past. What's worked well, what hasn't worked well. So are you ready to build the bench? Do you have the equipment that may be needed to build a bench? Do you have the understanding of how to operate that equipment? Do you have the skills and knowledge needed to make something like a bench? And as far as equipment go, you may have a basic set of equipment. You may want that new table saw, or you may want a new router, but instead you proceed with what you have and what you know. In this case, maybe you've got a couple hand saws and a hand drill, and you're going to make those work. And do you have the skills and knowledge to create it? As you've never done any woodworking, you may be lacking in skill. The more type of woodworking, the more practice you've done, the more you've built up those skills. The more you've encountered problems in the past, you've added that to your knowledge base so you can solve those problems more easily in the future. So you'll find along the way that you have to adopt both the design and also the execution of that design to the equipment you have, to the knowledge you have, and the skills that you have. So building a great beer starts the same way. It's high-level design. What kind of beer do you want to make? What style is it? Does it even fit a style? Are there characteristics or flavors that you want in your beer? So once you've got that high level view of what you want in a beer, then it's time to move into the next stage where it's defining that executable goal, your recipe. In this case, maybe you're creating your own, or maybe you're finding an existing recipe. So in this stage, we translate some of those ideas into specifics. What are the ingredients I'm using? What are the gravities that I want? What are the IBUs and bitterness? What are the other characteristics? And even if you're buying somebody's recipe or using a recipe you found, you're using your existing knowledge to understand what that recipe is going to create for you. And you may need, once you've got an idea recipe, you may need to adopt that based on like what supplies can you get at your local homebrew shop or easily obtain at the store. And just like when you were building a bench, you need to adopt the recipe based on your knowledge and your skills. So now, are you ready to brew the beer? You've got a recipe? Well, maybe not, just like in before. Do you have the equipment that's needed to brew that recipe? Do you have the knowledge of your operating your own equipment? Have you built that up? Do you have the specific skills? If you're brewing a sour beer, have you done a sour beer? If you're doing a large gravity beer, have you done that before? Have you built up that skill set? And when it comes to equipment, there's always this desire for something bigger and better. We may want that stainless steel electric system and those shiny conical fermenters. But instead, we move ahead with the type of equipment that we have and the type of equipment that we have knowledge using. So skills, if you've never brewed beer before, you're probably lacking some of the core skills. If you have brewed before, well, as you brew more and more, you build up your skill base. And the more times you encounter challenges, maybe a stuck fermentation or some yeast that seems dead, you've kind of learned to solve those problems. So the next time when you encounter those problems, you're able to move forward. So just like in our building analogy, we're going to adopt creating our beer based on the equipment that we have, the knowledge that we have, and the skills that we have. So as I mentioned before, the term building it's more encompassing than just brewing. So it's before and after brew day, so we're looking up to build up our knowledge base over several batches. We're looking at the understanding of a process's ingredients as we use different hops and different yeast and different grains. We build up that knowledge. We're defining our goals for brewing. We're defining our goals for our recipe, formulating our recipe. We're actually executing that recipe. And then once we have it, we're fermenting it. We're making sure we're pitching the right amount of yeast. We're keeping it under control of temperature. And then once the beer is done fermenting, how are we going to package it? Are we going to serve it? Are we bottling it? Are we kegging it? Do we have a kegerator? But I don't want to get the impression I'm talking about you need expensive equipment and you need to follow complex procedures. That's not the case. Just like building a bench, you could start off with a basic set of hand tools. That may be all you ever get by is using stuff like hand tools and chisels and planes. You may have a basic set of power tools that you've moved into. You've got your saw and you've got a router that's able to put to work. You may look at something and see, oh boy, I really wish I had that fancy electronic CNC machine. That would make stuff faster. But most of us don't have those type of equipment. So brewing beer is the same way. There's lots of ways to brew and build beers. It doesn't have to be fancy equipment. You may enjoy using purchased kits. You may enjoy finding published recipes. You may enjoy extract brewing with steeped grains, extract brewing with a partial mash, or you may enjoy all grain brewing. With all grain brewing, there's lots of options. There's brew in the bag, there's electric all-in-one systems, there's fancy computer controlled systems. When it gets to fermentation, you can manually control your opening vents and moving a fermenter around. You can have a fairly inexpensive fridge or freezer that you have a controller on, or you can have a high-end conical fermenter with a glycol system. You may be bottling your beers. You may be putting them in a simple keg. You may have a fancy kegerator with taps that people come over. All these are valid options. I'm not saying you need to have expensive and complex, but you do need to make sure you understand the equipment you have and the process that you follow. So as we get a little closer to actually drinking some beer, I just want to cycle back to Cascades Homebrew, both the website and the YouTube channel. So what are the goals? I have 3 big goals and 3 focuses that I have. So one of those is investigative brewing. I use the word investigative over experimental because experimental kind of thinks you're just using wacky ingredients. In this case, we're really just trying to dig into the details, evaluating ingredients. What do these hops taste like? What is this grain compared to this other grain? We're looking at process. What is different dry hop techniques? What does different fermentation temperatures impact your beer? Second is brewing processes and tips. And this is where we understand the equipment we have and we build up that experience. This is stuff like, how do I do brew in the bag brewing? How do I do a closed keg transfer? How do I maintain temperature controlled? How do I build a starter? And the third one is what I call building styles. So this goes beyond just recipes, and this is kind of what we're going to talk about today. I see there's a lot of places that publish a recipe, but they don't provide the background of the why that recipe there. Why were those grains selected? What are the options for the yeast in that? So this is where I'm looking at creating core versions of a recipe and then talking about variations. All right, so we get into Saison. So where am I at with building a great Saison? Well, I'm on my journey. I'm not there yet. I've brewed 4 recent batches of Saison over the last, so let's say, year and a half. I've also done a couple 1-gallon yeast trials with a couple different Saison yeasts. So I've made some progress, but there's lots that I want to learn. You know, I've only used a handful of Saison yeast, different grain bills. All of mine have been fairly similar so far. Hops, spices, fruits. I have not added any spices, any fruits, only a couple different hops that I've used. Mash temperatures and step mashing is something that I've been interested in trying out. You know, different fermentation temperatures and schedules. I feel like I've come up with one that seems to work for me, but what about a cooler ferment or a warmer ferment? And then bottle conditioning. I think bottling Saisons is a great way. So far I've only kegged my beers. The last one I have in a bottle, but that's just because I filled a bottle off the keg. So what are my goals in building a Saison? I want a flavorful beer. I want some yeast character. I think that's what sort of sets a Saison aside from a lot of other beers. I want a fairly refreshing beer, something light-bodied, something easy to drink. I want a kind of a moderate ABV. Maybe I can have more than one. That's one thing I'm realizing with the attenuation of a lot of these Saison yeast. Your typical 1055 OG beer, it gets pretty high up there. A kind of a rustic character is fine with me. I'm not looking for sour or funky, though I may want to play with maybe Brett at some point. I like the sort of farmhouse lore, whether it's true or not, but the idea that farmer would use whatever ingredients, whether that was wheats or rye or spelt, whatever they had on hand to make a beer for their workers. Yeah, I'm a huge fan of Saison Dupont, so I look at that one for some inspiration as well. So I've mentioned I've gone through a couple iterations of a Saison recipe. My goal here really was to build a beer and then try to make some minor tweaks and learn as I go. So if we look at the grain bill, these all have been a Pilsner base, although I've used some different Pilsner malt. All of them have had rye. I like that, again, that kind of ties back in with a little bit of that farmhouse idea. I think rye adds a little bit of kind of that earthy, character that I could see a farmer using. So sugar in a Saison. So my first 3 batches all had sugar in them. Kind of was based off some inspiration of other recipes. And I kind of decided I wasn't looking to drive the ABV. I'd rather have a little bit lower alcohol beer. So I moved the sugar from this latest batch. This latest batch had some biscuit malt in it. I kind of like the idea of adding a little bit of more complexity versus just the Pilsner, whether it's a biscuit malt, an aromatic malt, or maybe something like a Munich malt. For hops, I've been using Northern Brewer sort of as a generic bittering hop for my Belgian beers, mostly just because I don't really like using like 2 and 3% alpha acid hops for bittering. So then as far as hops go, I've been using Hersbrucker on some of the batches and Citra on the other ones. I find Hersbrucker is maybe a little bit more of a traditional Saison, where the Citra adds just a little bit of a citrus character. It makes it kind of nice. So these 4 batches have been a mix of either Saisonstein from Omega or the Dupont strain, in this case WLP 565. I also got a couple trial batches where I compared the Belle Saison to the Dupont strain. So here's the recipe statistics for the most recent batch. This was a Saison with about 5.5 gallons into the fermenter, targeting about a 73% efficiency. This particular one, it clocked in at 1057 with a final gravity of 1006, which gave me just about 7%, 6.9% alcohol. IBUs 39, light color 5.5. The grain bill on this one was 93% Pilsner malt, 12.5% rye malt, and then a 4.5% of a biscuit malt. And these were, in this case, these were all malts from a specialty craft maltster in Charlottesville, Virginia, named Murphy and Brewed. So maybe not traditional Belgian style, but I thought they would work out well. So in this particular batch, I didn't add sugar. Like I said, I'm not necessarily looking for a high ABV Saison, so I thought maybe leaving the sugar out, maybe help it out a little bit. So as I mentioned, I've been using Northern Brewer as my bittering hop. So this one had Northern Brewer for the full 60-minute boil to give me about 17 IBUs. And then I used an ounce or 28 grams of Citra both in late boil and then in the flame out, just to kind of give a little bit of flavor, a little bit of hop aroma, a little bit of that citrus character. Werfelock and the yeast nutrient were added into the boil. The yeast for this one was a Dupont strain, WP 565. In this case, I was using slurry that I had harvested from the prior batch. So the water profile is up on the screen. It's still a work in progress. I'm kind of feel like having a higher level of sulfate should help kind of the dryness, but it was something I want to play with in the future. So to hit that water profile, I needed to add a little bit of gypsum to my tap water, and also needed to use some phosphoric acid to try to hit my pH. I always add a little Campton tablet to remove chlorine and chloramines. So remember, if you're using your own water, or if you're using distilled or RO water, your additions would be different. So I matched this one at 148 degrees Fahrenheit, or a little over 64 degrees Celsius, and then went for 90 minutes just because of the lower temperature. This was to try to drive some attenuation, especially since I wasn't adding sugar into this batch. The batch had a standard 60-minute boil. So as far as fermentation, the schedule that I'm finding that I enjoy is I pitch it at 68 degrees. I'm going to let the beer free rise. In this case, it's in a contained environment in my chamber, but not adding heat or cold. In this case, the batch itself got up to about 80 degrees Fahrenheit, about 26.7 degrees Celsius. And this was on day 2, so it was pretty active generating heat. After that started to cool down, I set my heater just to maintain that 78 degrees Fahrenheit temperature. And I let that go for 13 days total. Then I did a closed transfer into a keg. Bottles I have today were ones that were filled from the keg using my no stinking beer gun approach. So not a beer gun, just kind of a plastic tube into a picnic tap. All right, so I think that was enough talking. How about I open up some beer and see how it turned out? So this is the Saison that was brewed in that 5-gallon brew in the bag walkthrough video. So if you're curious how it was brewed, make sure you check out that video. It's about 2 months it's probably been in the bottle, or at least it was kegged. It's been in the bottle. These were bottles that were filled off a keg. The competition scoring is going on, maybe even today, tomorrow, through the weekend. I think by Saturday I should, at least the medal round, I'm not sure when I will know my scores. So we're gonna open up this bottle and try not to knock it over this time. So I've got this small cup that would be similar to what they may use it in judging, and then I've got another cup to enjoy. Basically what I'm looking for is, how does it look? Is the carbonation seem adequate? A Saison should be a little higher carbonated than some beers. There's a nice pop. Maybe that was because I shook it up a little bit there, but I'm seeing some bubbles as it moves through the glass. I tried to raise the carbonation up a little in the keg before I kegged it, but there's only so much I can do in my bottle conditioning. So I'm a little curious. I haven't had this beer in a while, and sometimes in the past, the Saisons that I bottled and set aside were really good in a couple months. Initial thoughts: the head seems kind of fizzy, and it's kind of dissipating pretty quickly. Clearly the color is fine. Color looks good. We'll bring these in for a little closer look. Nice looking beer. Like I said, it's got some carbonation to it. The head retention maybe it's lacking there. So now I am going to go ahead and sample these beers. I'm going to fill out a BJCP score sheet. This is something that I'm trying to get some experience with. And then I'm going to try to compare the way I score it and some of the comments that I put down with what the competition judges do. So we'll be back in just a second. And we're back. So somehow this beer has disappeared and the score sheet is now filled out. So it's I think this has been an interesting exercise. Just I don't have a lot of experience with filling out the BJCP score sheets. I do a lot of judging for my club when I use a simplified 20-point scale. So this is kind of an interesting. And one thing I'm wondering, I realize, as a brewer, it's an advantage and disadvantage is that I know what ingredients are in the beer. I know the process that occurred. I know the original gravity, final gravity, the ABV, and those type of characters. So, do I get citrus character in the beer because I know I added citra hop, or do I get citrus character because there's citrus character in the beer? And the other thing, with my scoring, I'm realizing one thing that I don't know. I have a vision of what the style should be. I've got a target, and that's the target that I'm trying to brew toward. And I'm judging based on how close I am to that target. I try to take into account style guidelines, not just because I like a porter with mint in it. I'm going to give a porter with mint in it good style points. But I guess the question is, if I'm shooting for this target and I'm judging for that target, is the judge at the competition looking for something different, something a little more roasty, something a little more sweet, something with some different character. So it'd be interesting to see if, I feel like some of my scores I feel like they're appropriate, but they may be higher than what I'll actually get it from the competition. So if we cycle back to the beer, and I've given an overall score of a 38. 38 puts it into the, just the very bottom line of the excellent category. So is it an excellent example? Yeah, maybe. Maybe it could be a couple points lower. So let's look at where I scored it. Aroma, I think it's got some nice spicy yeast-driven aromas to it. It's got a touch of a citrus with some grain character to back it up. I think it's got a nice aroma. I do get, and I mentioned in the flavor, a little bit of like a fruity, apple-y kind of thing, but I don't think that's inappropriate for the style. I give it a 9 out of 12 for aroma. Appearance, I give it a 2 out of a 3. I think it's a wonderful looking beer. The knock with appearance, it really is in the carbonation. I knocked a couple points off down in mouthfeel for that. Definitely it doesn't have the carbonation level I would like, so that's where I'm probably looking to getting good with bottle conditioning saisons to try to drive that. Flavor, I thought the flavor is really nice. I give it a 16 out of 20. Peppery yeast character, mild grain, malt character, some earthiness to it. And again, that's where I know there's rye in there, so I'm looking for some rye earthiness. So, will the judges get that? And then that's where I mentioned a touch of a kind of appley fruit character, which I don't think is inappropriate for the style. But it'd be interesting to see if the judges pick that out and how they think about that. Mouthfeel, it's just got medium level of carbonation, which is not what the style wants. It should be an effervescent beer. So I give it a 3 out of a 5. I could potentially justify, giving even a 2 out of 5. Though I think in general, the body is really nice. It's got just a touch of maybe an alcoholic warmth to it doesn't stand out as harsh. Overall impression, and again, this is where it's kind of what I'm shooting for. I give it an 8 out of a 10. I could understand a lower. Instead, it's a nice, refreshing beer. It's got a nice backing, complex yeast character, balanced hop flavors and aroma. And the low carbonation detracts. So I think if I had gotten the carbonation up on this one in the bottled beer to appropriate, I think it would have definitely got a couple more points. It'd be interesting to see how it does. Saisons, it's a style that's got a lot of different interpretations, whether you're adding, in this case, rye, what hops to use. In this case, I used, American craft malt. Is that a detractor versus using a quality, Belgian malt? I don't know, we'll see. Like I mentioned, the competition judging should be going on now. This Saturday, there's an award ceremony online that's being streamed. So I think I'll at least know if I won any medals. I don't know when I'll get my scores back, and I'm not sure. It'll probably take a few weeks for them to mail score sheets. Will there be, a medal? I got 4 entries in there. My hopes, I'm hoping. I think I'm a pretty good brewer. I'm hoping I'm competing for some medals, but I don't want to set my hopes too high. But if you stuck around this long, well, thanks a lot. I really enjoyed talking to you about building great beers, and I really enjoyed sitting down and sharing this beer and talking about how we got here. My goal for the building and the discussion of how I got here is not so much like this is the way that you should build a Saison, but I think just an overall discussion on how you maybe incorporate if you're looking at brewing something, whether it be an IPA or a Doppelbock, starting with a recipe, iterating over that recipe, and then kind of just learning which yeast do you like, which grains do you like, what character are you shooting for, and iterate over that recipe. Maybe get it into a competition and see. But again, thanks for dropping in. Hit that subscribe and like button, and let's get out there and build some great beer.